Well, thank you. It's really a privilege to be here. I just want to welcome you personally to this amazing conference. Very good. And it is special for me. It's a little bit of a homecoming. I'm a proud graduate of St. Louis University, as Elliot said. And you know, that period, I was here in the late 90s, finished my dissertation in 2003, was really a pivotal point for me. I had sort of come out of academe and actually a pretty nice ivory tower where I was very happy, and got into this world of healthcare ethics, and it was really here at St. Louis U that I discovered the world of Catholic healthcare and the fact that one could go out and take the ideas and beliefs and try to maintain a ministry to build a ministry. So that this was a very important part of my life. I get one of the privileges of going first is I get to make an announcement that's going to sound very fresh. I have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. So the conference I think is so unique, not only because again of our many various and strong partners, but because it is so multidisciplinary, because we are going to look at so many practical topics to carry the principles of Humanae Vitae forward. And yet the planning committee realized that, again, with such a diverse audience and with so many topics, that we wanted to start with a re-examination of Humanae Vitae. Get us all back on the page, so to speak, remembering what it said, appreciating it, and appreciating its significance for the work we do. And that's what I'm going to do in the short time that I have here. I really want to try to set the stage for all subsequent presentations and put Humanae Vitae into context. And to do that, I want to do three things. I want to re-examine it as a document of teaching and pastoral response, so that we can refresh our memory and hone our appreciation of some of the key qualities and features of the encyclical. Second, I want to provide some historical context for Humanae Vitae and the issues it addresses. And third, offer a few thoughts on the significance of Humanae Vitae for the healthcare ministry, both for Catholic institutions and for individual Catholics who practice within it, and anyone of goodwill. By the end of this presentation, I hope we have a better appreciation of the nature and teachings of Humanae Vitae, as well as a refreshed perspective on its significance. So let's look at the encyclical in context. We invited you last week to read or reread Humanae Vitae prior to this conference. When I did so myself, I was struck by some of its features, its brevity, its constructive approach, and the balance in it of pastoral concern with authoritative guidance. I'm going to unpack each one of these features in part one of my presentation. So Humanae Vitae is organized very clearly into three parts, and I'm going to speak initially to parts 1 and 3. In part 1's introduction, Blessed Paul VI acknowledges that recent developments have raised new questions about the traditional teachings of the Church. And it's interesting that the first one he mentions is fear of overpopulation, and that was of overriding concern in the late 60s and actually well through the 70s. However, it appears that that issue has been ruled out as any kind of issue for the foreseeable future. And even the New York Times a couple of years ago ran a big feature on Paul Ehrlich and the population bomb, and essentially how none of the things that he predicted ever came to pass. Now, more enduring concerns, which are with us today, include the changing role of women in societies and challenges to large traditional families, as well as the growth of technological power, which of course has not slowed one bit. Pope Paul VI gives these developments their due and expresses a determination to answer the questions put to him with authority and integrity. In Part 3's Pastoral Directives, Blessed Paul devotes a few paragraphs to encouragement and advice on following church teachings with integrity and effectiveness before appealing to a wide range of groups, government authorities, scientists, spouses, doctors and nurses, priests and bishops, to properly address the new developments, questions, and technologies with sound policies and resources. I'm going to quote Humanae Vitae number 27 because it speaks so directly to the reason that we're here. Likewise, we hold in the highest esteem those doctors and members of the nursing profession who, in the exercise of their calling, endeavor to fulfill the demands of their Christian vocation before any merely human interest. Let them therefore continue constant in their resolution, always to support those lines of action which accord with faith and right reason. And let them strive to win agreement and support for these policies among their professional colleagues. It's a tall order. Moreover, they should regard it as an essential part of their skill to make themselves fully proficient in this difficult field of medical knowledge. Married couples have a right to expect this much of them. What is evident throughout Part 3 is Blessed Paul VI's appreciation of the challenges that people face and his respect for the role of members of the church and of society in creating life-giving responses to these challenges. Now, the core of Humanae Vitae, the core of the document, is in Part 2's doctrinal teaching and principles. And here, Blessed Paul VI spoke specifically, constructively, and authoritatively. Pope Paul spoke with specificity in focusing his teaching on married couples and the use of contraceptive drugs or interventions, rather than take on a wider range of questions about sexual morality. The key elements of this teaching are contained in 2 paragraphs in Part 2. So if you really wanted to see the key lines of teaching, they come in 2 paragraphs. Paragraph 11. The church, nevertheless, in urging men to the observance of the precepts of the natural law, which it interprets by its constant doctrine, teaches that each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life. And paragraph 14, excluded is any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation, whether as an end or as a means. That's a very high standard, and a higher standard than many felt was possible, than many hoped for. And it's not that Paul VI didn't have alternatives that had been presented to him. He had. Make it so that the entire marriage is open to human life. Make it so that certain uses of contraceptive measures or interventions are wrong. Those marked by hedonism or egoism or something like that. He had those. And I've got a lot of points to cover. I think it would, to really reflect on that, and not just the practical concerns, but the deep insight into reality, I think really merits more time. I just wanted to note that. It's important to point out that in the very next paragraph, Blessed Paul acknowledged in principle, as not the immoral equivalent of contraception, the use of medical technology or interventions in treating pathologies and diseases which might have the side effect of impairing fertility. He stated, on the other hand, the church does not consider at all illicit the use of those therapeutic means necessary to cure bodily diseases, even if a foreseeable impediment to procreation should arise therefrom, provided such impediment is not directly intended for any motive whatsoever. You know, it's interesting to note, in 2011, a Guttmacher Institute survey found that 14% of women on the pill were using it for purposes completely distinct from contraception. Completely distinct. And that was a different group than the 58% of women on the pill who were using it for a reason or a goal over and above contraception. So these things are out there. To properly interpret and apply the guidance in this paragraph, there is much to unpack from the Catholic tradition as to the sources of morality and human action, and also from medical science as to whether various off-label uses of hormonal contraceptives are necessary or prudent or clinically responsible. However, Blessed Paul VI acknowledged that such actions are morally distinct from the contraceptive behaviors addressed by Humanae Vitae. Second, Blessed Paul VI spoke as constructively as possible in explaining the reasons for his teaching and even in expressing his teaching. He did not employ strong language of censure and condemnation. When in 1930 the Anglican Church became the first Christian church to approve in principle some use of birth control within marriage, the reaction was strong and sharp. Here's one example. It is impossible to reconcile the doctrine of the divine institution of marriage with any modernistic plan for the mechanical regulation or suppression of human life. Carried to its logical conclusion, the Lambeth Committee's report would sound the death knell of marriage as a holy institution by establishing degrading practices which would encourage indiscriminate immorality. The suggestion that the use of legalized contraceptives would be careful and restrained is preposterous. Who do you think said that? Does anyone know who'd be saying something like that at the time? Pius XI. Pius XI was the Pope, and that's an excellent guess. That was actually the Washington Post. Now, I know we have some young people among us, so for any millennials or Gen Xers, that was before Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. Pius XI did weigh in a statement in Casti Connubii on chaste marriage, almost as strongly as the Washington Post, and said the Catholic Church raises her voice in token of her divine ambassadorship and through our mouth proclaims anew any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and of nature, and those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of grave sin. So that was Pius XI. Instead, Pope Paul praised the goods which must be respected and with which contraceptive behaviors are incompatible. And Blessed Paul VI embraced new terms to reframe the traditional teachings of the Church. For example, rather than use a traditional academic and scholastic terminology, Blessed Paul referred to the two meanings of the marital act, the unitive and the procreative. He cited and affirmed the need for consent as an indispensable condition of respecting and achieving the unitive good, and then appealed to the widespread acceptance of this condition in explaining the need similarly to not deny or override the procreative meaning of marital love. It's interesting that even 50 years later, I have yet to see an argument justifying in principle the good of overriding or avoiding consent in marital relations, and indeed in any sexual relations. So that's interesting. In terms of doctrinal principles, Blessed Paul founded his conclusions not on one biblical proof text or a past magisterial teaching, but on a deeper underlying framework and fundamental goods. The goods are the nature of marriage, of marital love, and of responsible parenthood, what they are and what it takes to embrace them successfully. The underlying framework to which Pope Paul appeals is that of the natural law. While this is an ancient and complex moral framework, in the Catholic moral tradition, it means that human beings have the ability and the obligation to discern and respect the moral order that exists in nature, in human nature, and in the most fundamental human relationships. Last one, please. In so doing, Pope Paul appeals to the most fundamental beliefs of the Christian faith, to the wisdom and love of God revealed in the orders of creation and redemption. We can acknowledge a great degree of complexity in the elements, history, and human understanding of these goods and of this order. But an appeal to natural law does not mean that a teaching is undeniable by anybody. Rather, it means that it is intelligible because it is based in an order in reality that can be discerned, understood, and so on. The teachings, terminology, and approach of Blessed Paul VI have not only been affirmed by the magisterium of the Church, but they have gone on to inform the Church's response to the emerging technologies of assisted reproduction. Finally, Blessed Paul taught in an authoritative manner. This is precisely what was expected of him, and he responded in a manner consistent with the mission of the Church and of his office. Pope Paul signaled the authority of his answer with the kind of instrument that he used to communicate his teaching, an encyclical. Now, popes use all kinds of documents and instruments to accomplish all kinds of things and to teach all kinds of things. And there's a great guide to them up on the screen from Claudia Carlin. Here's a list of those instruments in relative order of authority or importance. Number one is decretal letters, when something like a canonization or beatification is proclaimed. Apostolic constitutions for definitions of dogma and changing key church structures. Pope Francis, just a couple of weeks ago, issued an apostolic constitution. Those are rare. Then there's an encyclical, and then you go down the line. And of course, popes give all kinds of speeches, and they have an authority. But an encyclical is probably one of the most authoritative and frequently used instruments that a pope can make use of. As I said, oops, let me go back 1 second here. Blessed Paul VI, his teaching, authoritative in itself, has been affirmed by all subsequent popes, and this authority is important to bear in mind not only when forming one's own conscience and courses of action, but also for Catholic healthcare institutions and providers for formulating mission, operational, and practice plans. And I'm going to return to this thought in the final section. In retrospect, as a document, Humanae Vitae provides a well-founded response to a complex and recent controversy. It starts with an honest acknowledgement of the issues and moves on to a clear statement of goals and moral guidance. It provides the standards for and an explanation of that guidance. It speaks with specificity in a constructive manner and with an evident appreciation of the challenges and of the persons who will have to work together to respond to them. Okay, let me move on to historical context. And I'm a big fan, I guess, of learning history. In general, I believe we can't understand why things are as they are unless we know more of how they came to be that way. And it's sort of with that thought in mind that I want to talk about 3 historical eras I think we need to know a little more about to appreciate Humanae Vitae. The first era is going to be the year 1968 and the environment into which it was released. The second era will be history before the 1960s and Humanae Vitae, and the third era will be the 50 years since. So I'll be moving quickly through some of those years. Humanae Vitae was released on July 29th, 1968. Now, why put an exclamation mark on the year 1968? Because 1968 was one of the most turbulent years in 20th century cultural history in the United States and in particular in Europe. The English historian Paul Johnson called 1968 the year of America's suicide attempt. Cardinal Francis Stafford, then a parish priest in the Archdiocese of Baltimore, calls it the year of trial for the church, the kind of trial or temptation which we ask God to spare us when we pray the Our Father. Key features of this year made it very difficult for Humanae Vitae to be thoughtfully heard and implemented. Now, the 1960s had been an eventful decade before 1968. Within the Church, the Second Vatican Council, which had run from 1962 to 1965 had brought tremendous changes. Beyond its many pages of documents and teachings, Vatican II was portrayed in the media as the church opening up its windows and catching up with the modern world. The changes were not just academic or theological, they impacted people in their daily lives. For example, the Mass, the center of Christian worship, changed from a formal, mostly silent ceremony in Latin to a much more informal, participatory ceremony in local languages. The discipline of meatless Fridays, long a badge of identity for Catholics in public, also was significantly modified just 1 year before Humanae Vitae. In 1968, Catholics had seen many changes, and they expected to see many more. And Pope Paul VI perhaps himself contributed to an expectation of change by waiting so long to issue Humanae Vitae. It was in 1963 that Pope John XXIII set up a papal commission to study, in particular, the new birth control pill, which had been released in 1960, and the issues that it caused. In 1964, Pope Paul VI renewed that commission and added more members. But as the years went by, particularly after the close of the Second Vatican Council in 1965, and after a report of that papal commission was leaked to the press in 1967, revealing that a large majority of its members thought some change should be made in church teachings, the expectation of that change was coming, was widespread. It was very, very powerful. But 1968 also brought social upheaval and revolution in America and in the world more broadly. Major events shook the foundations of the established order. To recall some of these events might help us to almost reconnect with the turbulence of those times. For example, the Tet Offensive took place in January 1968, shocked the American public and fueled even more and more violent anti-war protests. Martin Luther King was assassinated April 4th, 1968, and weeks of riots and unrest followed. Robert Kennedy, just 2 months later, June 5th or 6th, was assassinated in Los Angeles. The Democratic National Convention, a little later in August 1968, brought violent protests and an even more violent response into American politics. And it was this convention that changed the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party has been a significant part of some of the cultural changes that we've seen. And finally, large-scale revolutions took place in Europe, especially in France and Czechoslovakia. This is a map of people on strike in in France. In May 1968, within 1 month, it went from almost nobody to over 10 million people. The country almost came to a standstill. And in Czechoslovakia, when they pushed for more freedom, the Soviet Union sent in tanks. The spirit of revolution, however, was not confined to the secular world. When Humanae Vitae was released, an organized campaign of protest and rejection was launched by some American theologians and priests, as reflected in this headline. This truly was an unprecedented and deeply harmful initiative. They did this within hours of the encyclical's release. This is before the internet, and never had anything like this happened. Taken together, the widespread expectations of more change, organized rebellion, and the overall turbulence of the time created a climate for preemptory rejection of the encyclical. It became impossible to create a framework for calm, considered reflection and discernment, and apparently people soon quit trying. We appreciate now that time does not heal all wounds, that some traumas and injuries don't heal on their own. While we cannot change history on a macro scale, as individuals and as organizations, we should take the time to reconsider the wisdom of Humanae Vitae as it was intended to be given and received. Now, the history before Humanae Vitae and birth regulation and birth control in human history. Years ago, I thought that contraception and various things with it were modern inventions. However, rather than being a product of the Enlightenment or of the 20th century, human beings have long sought to regulate their fertility, to avoid or to achieve pregnancy, perhaps since leaving the Garden of Eden. The pursuit of fertility regulation stems not just from individual wants, but also from human biology, social needs, and human nature. Within the context of evolutionary biology, human beings are unique animals, not just because of our rationality. Even among primates, because we do not experience periods of seasonal estrus and mating. Rather, women have a monthly and mostly hidden fertility cycle. Beyond biology, social conditions such as limited food supplies or competition for resources can create pressures to limit the number of children. And our rational nature allows humans to understand the goals that fulfill us and to exercise voluntary control in pursuing them, rather than relying on instinct or chance. Contraceptive formulas have been found in Egyptian papyri dating to 1900 BC and are mentioned in the writings of Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Corpus. Soranus, a physician who practiced medicine in Rome between about the year 100 and 135 AD, could distinguish between various contraceptive and abortifacient agents. Although it declined over time in Christian Europe, over the centuries, widespread awareness of a variety of contraceptive measures and behaviors can be traced in scholarly documents and in folklore between the fall of the Roman Empire and the Industrial Revolution. Modern science, technology, and ideologies have significantly modified, but did not create the motive to understand and rationally regulate human fertility. Birth control in the Catholic moral tradition, Christians encountered the practice of contraception and worse, infanticide and abortion, right from the start. And right from the start, such behaviors were consistently condemned and discouraged. For example, St. Paul's letter to the Galatians specifically condemned pharmakeia, which is thought to refer to contraceptives or abortifacients. The consistent Catholic and Christian moral tradition is well documented in John Noonan's 1965 book titled Contraception. I'm going to read just a short sentence from the preface because it really summarizes that tradition. Quote, since the first clear mention of contraception by a Christian theologian circa 200 to 230 AD, the articulated judgment has been the same. The teachers of the church have taught without hesitation or variation that certain acts preventing procreation are gravely sinful. No Catholic theologian has ever taught contraception is a good act. He could say that in 1965. The teaching on contraception is clear and apparently fixed forever. Now, Noonan wrote this book to make a case that some exceptions could be made, and that's the significance of that word apparently. However, along the way, he showed just how consistent the Catholic moral tradition has been. Now, there's much more to the story of the Church's teaching on marriage, marital love, and procreation than a simple no to birth control. Christian theology and witness on marriage and sexuality are not as uniformly negative as sometimes portrayed. Indeed, these goods were often acknowledged and praised, although not in the same framework or manner that arose in the Romantic era and in the 20th century. Noonan records a history of real struggle and growth, of the laity to integrate the moral guidance they were given with complex human goods, and of theologians, priests, confessors, bishops, and popes to do justice to the goods of marriage and conjugal love while rejecting acts and ideas which failed to respect them. Unfortunately, throughout most of human and church history, if people wanted to avoid pregnancy while pursuing marital relations, practically the only action possible was some kind of contraceptive measure. The scientific theory and evidence that people needed to understand and respect the cyclic periods of fertility and infertility were not produced until well into the 20th century. By then, a combination of modern values and technologies had driven most efforts in the direction of suppressing or thwarting human fertility rather than in appreciating or acting in harmony with them. It took only a few short years to move from the introduction of the pill in 1960 to the sexual revolution and then to the release of Humanae Vitae. So what to say about history after Humanae Vitae, the history of the last 50 years? A lot of water has gone under the cultural bridge. We can acknowledge an overwhelming embrace of contraceptives and contraceptive mentalities by women, couples, public officials, corporations, governments. We can acknowledge that the use of contraceptives has been a contributing factor to women pursuing higher levels of education, a wider range of careers, and more time in the workplace. And finally, one can argue that the consumer and service economy, which has grown up in the West over the last 50 years, has been driven in part by contraceptives' role in families having more disposable income and fewer children on whom to spend it. On the other hand, the last 50 years can also be viewed legitimately as a series of unfortunate events justifying the prudential concerns or worst fears of Pope Paul VI. Famously, in Humanae Vitae number 17, Pope Paul listed 4 negative results that a principled acceptance of contraceptive behaviors would bring about. And these include an increase in marital infidelity, a general lowering of moral standards affecting the young in particular, an increasing objectification of women by men, and government interference in marriage and procreation. Mary Eberstadt has compiled an impressive list of correlations between Pope Paul VI's words and social development since then in a couple of articles in 2008 and 2018, the 40th and 50th anniversaries of Humanae Vitae. And there have been more ramifications which Paul VI perhaps could not have foreseen. For example, the number of sexually transmitted diseases or infections has gone from 2, there were 2 in America in 1960. There are now at least 25 different STIs out there. The total fertility rate of almost every Western nation has fallen to well below population replacement levels. And there are disturbing new theories about the very nature and meaning of marriage and of sex and of gender, as I'm sure you're all aware. Fortunately, the history of this era has not been fully written, and it is my hope that we are beginning a new and more constructive chapter today. So, part 3, Humanae Vitae and Catholic healthcare. The Catholic healthcare ministry is ancient and in some respects always has been shaped by the richness of the faith and by perennial church teachings. But does Humanae Vitae in particular have significance for Catholic healthcare institutions and professionals today? I'm going to explore this question over the course of 3 topics: the history and the nature and the vitality of Catholic healthcare. So first, a couple more words about history. The history of Catholic healthcare is the story of our deepest beliefs applied in daily acts of care. Christians did not invent the profession of medicine, but we can take credit for the development of the hospital. What gave rise to hospitals was not merely caring for the sick in the late Roman Empire, but organized care for others, for strangers, for people not members of one's family or clan or not members of a paying client like the Roman legions. Hospitals have grown in size and complexity over the next 1,800 years, continually and profoundly shaped by religious orders and faith-inspired caregivers. Closer to us, Catholic healthcare in the United States has its own unique history, flourishing in a particular way in the 19th and 20th centuries, organized for the most part by orders of women religious. The Ursuline order had a hospital in New Orleans well before the foundation of the United States. The Sisters of Mercy established the first of their many hospitals in the United States in Pittsburgh in 1848. Over the next 60 years, over 800 Catholic hospitals were founded in the United States, to say nothing of the other ministries, such as schools of nursing. Christopher Kaufman's 1995 book, Ministry and Meaning, A Religious History of Catholic Healthcare in the U.S., provides the single best historical narrative of this growth. What emerges from the stories in this book is the amazing faith manifested by these religious women. Faith and hope and charity led the Sisters of Charity to remain here in St. Louis during a cholera outbreak in 1832, in which almost everyone fled. Faith, hope, and charity also enabled the Sisters of Mercy to go where no one else would or could go, to flop houses full of sick gold miners in San Francisco during the gold rush era. Faith supported these sisters, who at times confronted anti-Catholic time leaders and at other times charmed and inspired them to support their ministries. This impressive history demonstrates the power of living faith combined with courage and hard work to build a healing ministry and to change history. These religious women faced a forbidding and undeveloped frontier. We face a different landscape, more of a devolving moral wilderness. As we remember and take pride in their stories, we should consider our role and responsibility to add additional chapters. The nature of Catholic healthcare. The nature of Catholic healthcare is both mysterious, because it is a work of the Church, and specific. Christianity, perhaps more than any other religion, has defined a wide range of its core beliefs and standards in creeds, councils, and authoritative teaching. Our moral tradition, developed across centuries of prayerful reflection on issues old and new, from euthanasia in Greco-Roman civilization to artificial reproductive technologies in 21st century Western nation, is distilled in the ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services, or ERDs, to guide contemporary Catholic healthcare delivery in the United States. Fidelity in implementing the letter and spirit of the ERDs is essential for a healthcare ministry to be recognized as Catholic. Individual healthcare professionals are called to fidelity in their personal lives, and in addition to the appeal Pope Paul VI issued in Humanae Vitae number 27, the teachings of the Second Vatican Council in Gaudium et Spes urge professionals, including medical professionals, not to separate their personal faith from their public work and service. The ERDs contain 9 numbered paragraphs of guidance on assisting or preventing procreation. These directives clearly prohibit certain actions, and I don't have time to list them all, and call for constructive education and alternatives, both in assisting and in regulating or timing procreation. While this guidance is well known, I think there is room for improvement in more systematically affirming the principles of Humanae Vitae as a constitutive part of Catholic healthcare, especially if a Catholic healthcare ministry offers birthing or surgical or primary care services. These principles and teachings should be treated with at least the same respect as any other teaching or issue. Social teachings, teachings on the sanctity of human life, appropriate care for the seriously ill and dying, and so on, and integrated into educational, policy, and operational materials. I have one example I want to show you where I think this could have made a difference. In a national program trying to define Catholic identity in healthcare from around the year 2000. I'm going to give you a couple slides here to illustrate this. In the late 1990s, the Catholic Health Association created a major initiative to measure and strengthen Catholic identity in healthcare called Living Our Promises, Acting on Faith. It utilized and implemented an impressive survey instrument in 1999 and 2001, which had both quantitative and qualitative measures and looked at 5 major areas of modern Catholic healthcare delivery. So you can see them there: organizational culture, holistic care, care for the poor and vulnerable, care of the dying in relationship to the church. Now, these were not taken directly from the ethical and religious directives. They were clear about that. But there clearly were connections, and certainly the ERDs were used. What we can see is that organizational culture lines up very naturally with social responsibility, and number 5, relationship to the church, ties into issues covered in partnerships and cooperation, and there were other connections along the way. However, there was only one area which was not touched on, not measured, not defined in any way whatsoever, and that was anything in ERD Part 4. Now, that deals with a range of issues, from abortion to prenatal screening to genetic testing to prenatal care, and it deals with assistance, reproductive technologies and contraception and sterilization. So while some controversy was likely avoided, I think an opportunity to recognize, to measure, and to strengthen Catholic identity in this very important part of the ERDs was lost. Vitality in Catholic healthcare. Catholic institutions have to follow the teachings of the Church on marital love and procreation in a society which is most often uncomprehending and sometimes hostile. Several times as I would go to conferences some years ago, I heard accounts of frustration of having Catholic healthcare defined in terms of the things that we don't do. I know it's hard to overestimate the difficulty of faithful witness today. In the face of such challenges, it might appear that to avoid violations of the ERDs is all that can be done. Yet Catholic healthcare is called to be salt, leaven, and light in a world that needs some human wisdom and initiative confirmed, as well as a grace-inspired witness that transcends human imagination and even human standards. In a real sense, Catholic healthcare is called to be part of the Church's evangelization, not proselytization, and its efforts to build up the kingdom of God. Because this conference is focused on contemporary Catholic healthcare delivery, I wanted to introduce a thought for consideration, and that is whether starting a program of contemporary, high-quality fertility care services might contribute in a significant way to the vitality of a Catholic healthcare institution's mission. Of course, many different activities contribute to the mission of Catholic healthcare, and I know that merely surviving to operate another day or another fiscal year is an achievement. However, again, for consideration, vitality is more than hanging on or staying alive. For an individual, vitality means that the parts of the body are working well individually and together, and that the whole is integrated and functioning well, which for an individual is going to include a sense of purpose and demonstrated excellence in performance. For an institution, vitality means more than financial stability or operational effectiveness. It is evident when, beyond these factors, an organization has a strong identity, is committed to that identity and to high standards, and has a distinctive culture that inspires its associates to perform with excellence and to go beyond their ordinary duties. Vital organizations do more than succeed. They often inspire imitation and attract people to join or engage with them. So what does this have to do with the topic at hand? Well, first, creating a new fertility care services program might seem to be a non-starter on practical grounds. Isn't there an apparent lack of demand or adequate reimbursement? I know we're going to hear more later about whether such objections are well-founded. No doubt it would require an investment of resources and a great amount of hard work. Beyond what such a program would offer to patients, and it would be a distinctive program of service that would benefit patients and the community, would it not also benefit the organization? It would if it helped the Catholic institution to reflect more deeply and to commit more fully to our deepest beliefs and to educate its associates and its partners in the community about why these beliefs and why such a program is good for patients, good for health, and good for the community. Passing up such an endeavor might be more than a lost opportunity. It might contribute to the impression that there are some challenges for which the resources of our faith are not a match. And it might make it harder for us to withstand pressure from our cultural opponents who exhibit an unwavering faith in the rightness of reproductive rights, autonomy, and self-definition in all matters sexual. Let me just wrap up here. Having briefly reviewed the encyclical Humanae Vitae, aware that understanding and regulating human fertility are of perennial interest to human beings and to the Church, and hence to Catholic healthcare, it's time to move on to the next presentation of the conference to get an update on the science and schools of fertility awareness and of the latest data on their effectiveness. And later this afternoon, we're going to hear from 4 physicians who are practicing very different practice settings who have been inspired by the principles and the vision of Humanae Vitae. As we listen, I hope we will begin to reflect on the following questions. How can we build on the Church's long defense of marriage, marital love, and the family, and of human reason and freedom? How can we build on the latest advances in fertility awareness and clinical services? And how can this knowledge and these endeavors contribute to the Catholic healthcare ministry? As we continue to commemorate the encyclical Humanae Vitae, I hope we can begin to ask and answer these questions and many more. Thank you.